The year was 1847, and in the southern reaches of Georgia the heat pressed down like a living weight. Dust clung to the narrow roads, trees gathered in heavy clusters, and beyond them stretched the endless fields of cotton and tobacco, crops that shaped the destiny of America. Yet beneath this green and golden surface, the soil was watered not by rain, but by sweat and blood. The cries of the enslaved, their sweat-drenched bodies bent under the lash, and the scars carved into their flesh hung in the very air. The land looked bright, but its heart was soaked in darkness. It was in this world that the story of one woman begins, a woman whose name would, in time, become a curse. She was born into privilege, raised in a family where land and slaves were inherited like jewelry, where wealth was measured not by the coin in the chest, but by the number of human lives under your command. Her parents took her to church, paraded her in society gatherings, and drilled into her from childhood the belief that their blood was purer than any other, and that preserving this bloodline was a sacred duty. She grew into a striking young woman, educated in the ways expected of a southern lady. She knew how to host, how to smile, how to bend men to her will through charm. But beneath the fine dresses and the carefully curled hair was a mind already obsessed with blood and lineage. When she married a plantation master and, not long after, buried him, she found herself the sole mistress of vast acres of land and scores of enslaved people. The sudden power did not frighten her, it thrilled her. On her plantation, she reigned like a queen. Every life within those boundaries, every cry, every birth and death fell under her command. The enslaved were not people to her, but numbers, bodies to be bought, sold, and bred at her whim. They were not mothers and fathers, they were cattle. Her mind had read, used them to tools, and she wielded them with ruthless precision. But there was something different about this woman, something more twisted than even the ordinary cruelties of the South. Her obsession with bloodlines grew stronger with each year, until it warped into something monstrous. She did not see children as souls, but as instruments to extend her power. She began pairing enslaved men and women like livestock, forcing them into unions, driving them to produce more children to feed her estate's future labor. She called it management. They called it torment. It might have ended there, with cruelty hidden under the everyday practices of the South. But her obsession crossed a boundary no whisper dared to utter. For as her own sons grew into men, she turned her schemes upon them. The boys had been raised under her shadow, their father gone too soon, their mother's will absolute. They learned early that her word was law, that her hands could give comfort or strike fear. When they reached manhood, they should have inherited freedom, or at least a chance to step away from the suffocating plantation. But their mother had other plans. She demanded they take part in her breeding schemes, that they lie with the enslaved women, that they produce children who would belong to her, children whose blood could be claimed as both master and property. The sons resisted at first, horrified, but her control was iron. She used guilt, threats, and the weight of her power to crush their will. To defy her meant exile, ruin, perhaps even death, and so they submitted, broken, their shame buried in silence. The enslaved women bore the heaviest torment. Their bodies, already chained by the lash, became tools in the woman's twisted obsession. Nights in the cabins filled with muffled cries, with forced unions no one could resist. Some women tried to flee, others wept silently, and a few bore the children that would live as both heirs and property, symbols of a system that devoured its own. The neighbors suspected but said nothing. In the South, scandal was a quiet shadow, not a storm. Respectability was armor, and even the ugliest truths could be buried beneath silence if the family name was strong enough. The church prayed, the neighbors dined, and behind the closed shutters of the great house, horror reigned. Time moved on. The plantation grew older, its walls weathered, but the mistress never lost her grip. She lived for control, lived for the illusion that her family's bloodline was pure, even as she defiled it with her own hands. Her sons aged under the weight of her commands, some fleeing into the wider world, some breaking under the burden, and others trapped forever in the cycle she created. Among the enslaved, the story spread in whispers. They spoke of the mistress who forced her sons into the cabins at night, of the children born from that cursed union, of the madness that had poisoned the great house. They passed the tale quietly from one to another until it became part of the secret history of Georgia. Then came the war. The Civil War tore through the South like a storm of fire, and no plantation escaped untouched. The cotton fields turned red with blood, the roads filled with soldiers, and the future of slavery crumbled under the march of Union armies. The mistress tried to preserve her world, clutching at the last remnants of her power. But history had turned against her. The enslaved left as the armies came, her fortune withered, and her house became a husk of the empire it once was. By the time she died in the 1870s, little remained. The plantation was a ruin, her sons scattered or broken, and her name was spoken only in whispers. Official records hid the scandal, speaking politely of land and property, but never of the deeds done in the shadows. Yet silence itself is a confession. The very absence of her truth became proof of it. Even now, in the backroads of Georgia, some say her ghost lingers. They claim her footsteps can be heard where the great house once stood, her voice drifting through the night, calling the names of sons who fled her. Others say the cries of the enslaved still rise from the soil, carried on the wind as a reminder that no cruelty can ever truly be buried. Whether ghost or rumor, whether truth or legend, her story remains. It is a tale not only of one woman, but of the corruption of a whole system, of how slavery twisted even those who wielded its power. She sought to control life itself, to shape bloodlines like a god, but in the end, she destroyed her own legacy. Her empire collapsed, her family dissolved, and her name endured only as a warning that no dynasty built on cruelty can stand forever, and no secret born of obsession can remain hidden for all time. She had been born into privilege, yet even as a child she was marked by dows. Those who remembered her earliest years said she had a peculiar way of watching people, not with affection but with calculation, as if she were measuring what they were worth. Other girls in her circle spoke of dresses, of dances, of marriage prospects, but she listened silently, absorbing the lessons of power from her father's accounts and her mother's talk of lineage. In those years, Georgia was already bound to slavery as tightly as a body to its bones, and a child raised in wealth could not help but see human suffering as part of the natural order. Where other children played in gardens, she walked among the slave quarters with a strange fascination, not pitying the lives she saw but wondering how they might be bent to serve her. Her marriage was a brief interlude, and some whispered even then that she showed no grief at her husband's death. Whether or not that was true, his passing gave her more than it took away. The land, the house, the slaves, and the unchecked freedom of being a widow in a world where widowhood could grant more independence than marriage ever allowed. She wore black for a time, as was proper, but within those mourning clothes her heart was alight with ambition. The plantation became her kingdom. She oversaw the accounts herself, not trusting overseers with too much freedom. She knew the value of each enslaved body as carefully as she knew the value of a bale of cotton. She kept tallies of births and deaths, of how many children might be expected from a woman within a decade, of which men were strong enough to breed more like them. In her ledgers, they were reduced to numbers, and those numbers translated to profit. But behind the arithmetic was something darker than profit alone. There was desire for control, for mastery, not only over land and crops, but over blood and destiny itself. By the time her sons were old enough to sense the weight of her gaze, she had already turned the plantation into a breeding ground. Enslaved women were not asked but ordered into unions. Children were torn from mothers' arms and sold when it suited her. The quarters whispered that she watched births with the same hunger a farmer might watch a new calf enter the world. Not with tenderness, but with calculation. She believed she was shaping a future, but she was only carving scars into human lives. Her sons, raised within this atmosphere, learned early that their mother's love was conditional. She gave them fine clothes, tutors, and the appearance of gentility, but she demanded obedience without question. Her voice carried the weight of command, and to defy her was to invite ruin. When they reached manhood, she began to press her will upon them in ways they had never imagined. She told them it was their duty to strengthen the plantation, that their blood was too important to be wasted on outsiders, that they must do as she ordered. At first they resisted, revolted by her suggestions, but she reminded them of their dependence. She reminded them that the house was hers, the land was hers, and that without her they were nothing. Some nights, she summoned them to her chambers and spoke with the cold intensity of one possessed, describing how their children with the enslaved women would bind the estate together, would ensure that the bloodline never dissolved into weakness. She made the monstrous sound inevitable, even righteous. Under her relentless pressure, some sons broke. They obeyed her commands and carried the guilt in silence, their souls eroded by shame. Others fled, leaving the estate behind, their names barely mentioned afterward. But no one escaped unscarred. The enslaved bore the worst of it. They had known suffering long before, but this was a cruelty compounded, a violation of the most intimate kind. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters, but what warning could save them when the mistress of the house decreed their fate? Some women tried to hide in the fields, others feigned illness, but such efforts rarely succeeded. They endured because endurance was the only weapon left to them, and they passed the story in hushed tones, ensuring that memory itself became a form of resistance. The cabins at night became places of muffled cries, the air thick with despair. Yet within that despair flickered sparks of quiet rebellion. Songs carried hidden meanings, prayers were lifted in secret, and stories were told to children that planted seeds of survival. They told of deliverance, of freedom that might come, of a day when the mistress's power would crumble to dust. Meanwhile, the plantation lady believed herself untouchable. She held her head high in church, her gloved hands folded as if in piety, her eyes cool as she exchanged greetings with neighbors. Few dared question her, and those who whispered did so cautiously. Southern society was built on silence. Better to pretend not to see, better to nod politely, better to let the sins of the powerful sink beneath the veneer of respectability. In this way, her cruelty was shielded not only by her will, but by the cowardice of those around her. As the years passed, the weight of her actions grew heavier on her sons. Some drank themselves into stupor, others became harsh and brittle, lashing out at anyone weaker than themselves. One of them was said to wander the fields at night, speaking to himself, haunted by the faces of women he had been forced to harm. Another vanished entirely, whether by choice or by fate, no one could say. But all bore the brand aurat, if their mother's will, marked not on their skin, but on their souls. And still, she remained unmoved. She aged, but her obsession never weakened. Even as wrinkles lined her face and her body stooped under the years, her eyes burned with the same cold fire. She spoke less of society and more of legacy, less of wealth and more of blood. She did not see the ruin she had sown. She saw only her own vision of power. It was into this world of rot and silence that the first rumors began to escape the plantation's boundaries. A slave who managed to run north spoke of strange cruelties, of a mistress who bred not only her slaves, but forced her sons into the same practice. His tale was dismissed in some quarters as invention, but others heard truth in his voice. Neighbors muttered in half-phrases, servants carried gossip into town, and slowly the story spread like smoke from a fire no one dared extinguish. And then the war came, and with it, the unraveling of everything she had built. The Civil War was not kind to plantations. Armies trampled fields, houses were burned, and the enslaved seized whatever chance they could to escape. Her world collapsed around her. Those who had once bowed their heads to her authority walked away when Union soldiers arrived, and she, who had believed herself eternal, was left clutching only ruins. When the end finally came for her, sometime in the 1870s, she was a shadow of the woman she had once been. The plantation was gone, her wealth scattered, her sons broken or lost. The great house stood empty, its windows shattered, its walls cracked. Her name appeared in legal documents, an estate settled, land divided, but nowhere did the official words acknowledge the truth of her life. It was buried, as the South buried so many sins, under silence. But silence is never complete. Memory is a stubborn thing. Among the families who had once been enslaved on her land, the story survived. They told their children, and their children's children, of the woman who had tried to play God with blood and flesh. The tale grew sharper in the telling, not weaker, until it became not just memory, but legend, and legend lingers. They say that on certain nights where the house once stood, a woman's figure can be seen, tall and rigid, her face obscured, her voice calling names that the wind carries away. Others say they hear weeping from the soil itself, the cries of women and men who were broken there. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the story refuses to die, for some truths are too heavy to be buried. Her legacy was not the dynasty she dreamed of, nor the purity she sought to protect. Her legacy was shame, whispered in corners, carved into memory, woven into the haunted history of Georgia. And so she endures, not as a noble lady of the South, but as a symbol of its darkest corruption, proof that cruelty corrodes even those who believe themselves masters, and that the hunger for control can devour everything it touches. The war came not like a storm, but like a slow tightening noose. At first there were only whispers in the newspapers, talk of secession in parlors, and the sound of distant marches on faraway roads. But soon the tremors reached Georgia, and the plantation mistress, who had built her entire existence on control, felt the first threads slipping through her fingers. The markets shifted, cotton prices wavered, and rumors spread that the North might soon invade. For the enslaved, hope stirred faintly in the shadows, but for her it was the beginning of an unraveling. When the first sons of the South marched off in Confederate gray, she held her head high, declaring that her family's name and land would endure whatever storm came. Yet the truth was different. Her sons, already broken by years of her will, were not eager soldiers. One drank himself into a stupor and was deemed unfit for service. Another fled west under cover of night, leaving behind nothing but a bitter note, and the youngest, forced into uniform, returned within a year, wounded in body and shattered in spirit. She tried to boast of their duty, but the neighbors knew. They always knew, though they did not speak it. As Union forces drew nearer, the land itself seemed to betray her. Fields once white with cotton lay untended, laborers slipped away in the night, and the once proud house chewed with emptiness. She clutched her ledgers, still counting, still calculating, as if the numbers could hold the world together. But numbers could not stop the tide of history. The enslaved, sensing freedom's approach, grew bolder. Some walked off openly, their heads high, while others vanished silently, leaving behind only broken chains or an abandoned hoe in the field. The mistress raged. She screamed at those who remained, beat women with her own hands, and sent riders to drag back men who fled. But the power she once wielded so effortlessly slipped from her grasp like water through fingers. Even her sons, cowed for so long, began to defy her in small ways. The eldest locked himself in his room for days, refusing to attend meals. The youngest muttered openly that he wished her dead. The bonds that tied them to her had frayed beyond repair. When the Union Army finally reached Georgia, fire followed in its wake. Plantations burned, barns collapsed, and the roads filled with smoke. The great house, once a symbol of her pride, shook with the tramp of soldiers' boots. She stood in her doorway, her dress stiff with age and anger, demanding respect, but the soldiers laughed. They saw only another relic of a world that was dying, another tyrant clinging to illusions. They did not burn her house, though they stripped it bare of food, silver and livestock, leaving her surrounded by walls that echoed with emptiness. The end of the war brought no peace. Slavery was dead, at least on paper, but the scars remained in the soil and in the hearts of those who had survived her rule. Freedmen left her land, building new lives with whatever scraps they could find. Some stayed nearby, whispering stories of what had been done in the great house, passing them to their children as warnings. Others carried the tales north, where they were repeated with horror in abolitionist circles. The details shifted with each retelling, but the core remained the same. The mistress who had enslaved not only bodies but her own blood. Her sons did not recover. The eldest, bloated with drink, died within a few years of the war's end, found lifeless in a ditch after a night of staggering through town. The youngest drifted into madness, muttering names no one understood, wandering fields as if still searching for the lives he had helped destroy. The one who fled west was never heard from again, his name disappearing into the wilderness. In the end, her legacy of blood produced no heirs, no dynasty, but only ruin. And she herself, though she lived for several more years, was a shell of what she had been. Neighbors avoided her, not because they knew every detail, but because something clung to her, something foul and undeniable. Children crossed the road rather than walk before her gate. The church pew where she once sat proudly grew empty, for even the pious could not sit comfortably beside her. She spoke less and less, her once commanding voice reduced to mutters, her hands trembling as she clutched rosary beads that brought her no comfort. When death finally claimed her, there were no mourners. The notice in the local paper was brief, listing her name, her estate, and nothing more. No kind words, no praise for her gentility, no remembrance of charity or virtue. Her land was divided, her house fell into ruin, and her story should have ended there, swallowed by the silence of a society that preferred not to face its darkest truths. But stories like hers do not vanish. They rot, they linger, they seep into the soil. Among the freed families who had suffered under her reign, her name lived on as a warning. Mothers told their children never to forget the cruelty that had been done, never to let the past be buried without truth. And so the story endured, whispered across generations, reshaped with each telling but always carrying the same essence, that power corrupts, that silence protects evil, and that even the mightiest plantations could fall to dust. In the years that followed, when strangers passed through Georgia and asked about the ruins of the old estate, some locals would lower their voices and tell them fragments. They spoke of the lady who turned her own family into monsters, of sons who were destroyed by her will, of women who wept in the cabins and bore children whose fates were sealed before they drew breath. Some dismissed it as rumor, a grotesque exaggeration of southern cruelty, but those who looked into the eyes of the old freedmen who still remembered knew there was truth there, even if the details had been blurred by time. And so, long after her body was laid in the ground, she remained, not as she wished, not as the grand lady of dynasty, but as a figure of horror in the haunted folklore of the South. The plantation crumbled, the crops reclaimed by nature, but the whispers never ceased. At night, when the wind rustled through the trees, some swore they heard her voice, still commanding, still unyielding, calling for sons who could no longer answer. Others swore they heard the cries of the enslaved, woven into the earth itself, as if the soil refused to release the memory of pain. Her story became a shadow stitched into Georgia's history, a reminder that cruelty leaves stains too deep for time to wash away. She believed she was shaping a future of power and purity, but in truth she created only ghosts, and it is ghosts who tell her story now. After the war, Georgia was a scarred land. Fields lay barren, towns half-burned, and the South, once swollen with pride, now limped under the weight of defeat. The great plantations, once kingdoms unto themselves, were falling apart, their houses rotting, their gates rusting, their wealth gone with the wind. But some things did not vanish. Some things endured in the whispers of those who had lived through them. The story of the mistress, the woman who bred slaves with her own sons, survived in hushed tones. Freedmen who had once been her property carried the memory like a wound that refused to heal. Around campfires, in quiet kitchens, and under the spreading oaks where they gathered on Sundays, they spoke of the horrors they had seen. Not loudly, not to everyone, for they knew the world was not ready to listen, but quietly to their children, so the truth would not be buried. They told of the nights when her sons were forced into the cabins, of the cries that carried through the dark. They told of the children born with pale eyes and strange bloodlines, children who grew up neither fully master nor fully slave, trapped in a world that denied them both humanity and belonging. These children, marked by their very existence, became living reminders of what had been done in that cursed house. Some fled, trying to carve out lives elsewhere, but others remained, their faces a silent accusation to the family that had claimed to own them. By the 1880s and 1890s, when Reconstruction had faltered and Jim Crow rose like a new chain across the South, the tale of the plantation lady twisted into folklore. To white neighbors, it became a rumor they spoke of only in private, a scandal never written down but always hovering at the edge of conversation. To black families, it became a warning, a parable of cruelty hidden behind wealth and gentility. Mothers would tell their daughters, "Do not trust the fine houses. Behind the lace and the smiles, monsters can live." Her plantation, abandoned after her death, decayed year by year. Vines crept up, the walls, boards sagged and windows shattered. Local boys dared one another to enter, whispering that the place was haunted. They claimed to hear footsteps on the rotting stairs, or to glimpse a pale figure staring from a window, her eyes burning with command even from the grave. Some said her spirit still searched for her sons, dragging them back to her side to continue the cycle of control. Others said it was not her ghost, but the voices of the enslaved, still crying for justice, echoing through the ruins. As the 20th century dawned, historians began collecting the oral testimonies of formerly enslaved people. Many were old by then, their backs bent, their hair white, but their memories sharp as broken glass. In the Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s, fragments of her story appeared. Former slaves spoke carefully, sometimes with hesitation, for fear of retribution even decades after emancipation. But the truth slipped out in pieces, tales of a mistress who was harsher than any overseer, who controlled her sons like puppets, who forced women into beds against their will. The interviewers wrote the words down, though some dismissed them as exaggerations, as bitter gossip of a bygone world. Yet those who listened closely could hear the consistency. Too many voices telling too similar a tale. In the black communities of Georgia, her story hardened into legend. They began calling her the Lady of Shadows, or sometimes the Breeder, a name spoken with both fear and disgust. Preachers warned of her in sermons, using her life as an example of how unchecked sin could rot the soul. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance whispered about her in essays, though rarely naming her outright, fearful that the full truth might be lost if it clashed too directly with the whitewashed histories of the South. And yet, silence still wrapped her name in public. In the official record, she remained little more than a widow, a landowner, another Southern lady swallowed by history. The courthouse files listed her estates, the deeds of sale, the deaths of her sons, but nowhere did they mention the nights of forced breeding, the broken spirits, the children of incest. The paper trail was clean, as if a lifetime of horror could simply be erased with ink. But memory is stronger than paper. In the 1920s and 1930s, African-American storytellers began collecting the old tales, writing them down for the first time. Among them was the story of the Georgia plantation lady, retold not as a simple account, but as a ghost story, a morality tale, a dark legend that captured both the cruelty of slavery and the madness of those who wielded it. In these retellings, she became larger than life, her eyes glowing red, her sons transformed into shadows chained to her side, her plantation a cursed ground where crops would not grow. Folklore took hold, reshaping history into myth, but the truth at its core remained. She had been real, and the horror she wrought had been no fiction. By the mid-20th century, local historians stumbled upon these fragments and began to wonder, who was she really? Which plantation had been hers? Could the rumors of forced breeding with her own sons truly be traced to a single name, a single estate? Some dismissed it as exaggerated gossip, but others dug deeper. In letters, in half-burned diaries, in ledgers kept by her neighbors, traces began to emerge, traces that confirmed the outlines of the story, if not every detail. She had lived. She had ruled her plantation with an iron will. Her sons had suffered, and the children born in the cabins, carrying the blood of master and mistress alike, had lived and died under her shadow. Thus the story survived, traveling through generations, never written in the schoolbooks, never spoken in the proud halls of Southern families, but alive in the voices of the people, alive in the warnings mothers gave their children, alive in the whispers of old men by the fire, alive in the ruins of the plantation, where the wind still carried the sound of crying. And so her legacy stretched beyond her death, beyond the fall of her house, beyond the end of slavery itself. It lived on, not as she intended, not as a tale of purity and power, but as a testament to how cruelty poisons everything it touches. She had tried to build a dynasty, but instead she built a curse, and that curse was not bound to her alone. It became part of the fabric of Georgia's history, woven into its soil, its folklore, its haunted nights. By the middle of the 20th century, the plantation was nothing more than bones of timber and stone, swallowed by creeping vines and the slow reclaiming hand of nature. The once grand columns had cracked, the roof caved in, and owls nested in the rafters where chandeliers had once shone. To passing travelers, it looked like just another ruin of the Old South, a silent reminder of a world that had destroyed itself. But to the people of the region, especially to the black families who had long whispered of it, the house was no ruin. It was a tomb of memory. Children were warned not to wander near it. They were told that strange lights move, and in the windows at night, that the cries of babies could be heard drifting from the slave quarters, long since reduced to piles of stone. Local preachers wove the legend into sermons, warning that sin never dies quietly, that what is done in darkness will one day shout from the rooftops. And indeed, the tale did not fade. It deepened. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement surged, younger activists sought to reclaim the buried histories of slavery, the stories that had been hidden under layers of Southern nostalgia and denial. In interviews and pamphlets, fragments of the mistress's story appeared again. Writers spoke of a plantation in Georgia where horrors had gone beyond even the lash and the auction block, where incest and forced breeding had been woven into the system itself. Though many did not name her outright, those who knew the land and its history could recognize the ghost beneath the words. White historians of the South, still protective of family legacies, dismissed the story as folklore, calling it a grotesque invention meant to tarnish the image of Southern womanhood. But black scholars insisted otherwise. They knew that folklore was rarely born of nothing. It was rooted in lived experience, reshaped and retold, but grounded in truth. Oral history, they argued, was itself a kind of archive, one that could outlast any courthouse ledger or plantation inventory. By the 1980s, academic interest in the hidden histories of slavery brought a new wave of attention. Scholars combed through old diaries, letters, and transaction books, finding subtle confirmations. A neighbor had once written of strange practices at her estate. Another noted that her sons were peculiarly bound to her, unable to escape her command. A doctor's record mentioned children of mixed blood on the plantation who bore a striking resemblance to the mistress's sons. None of it was explicit, but the fragments built a picture, a mosaic of horror pieced together across time. Meanwhile, the legend in local culture only grew. In the 1990s, ghost tours began weaving her story into their roots, telling tourists of the Lady of Shadows who haunted the ruins of her estate. Some embellished it, saying she still walked with a whip in hand, dragging her sons behind her like chained animals. Others kept closer to the whispered testimonies, describing the cries of enslaved women and the restless spirits of children caught between bloodlines. Whether fact or folklore, the story drew listeners because it carried a truth deeper than documents. The South had been built not only on slavery, but on silence, denial, and sin. In the early 2000s, descendants of the enslaved families began to speak more openly. With genealogy tools and DNA testing, they traced lineages back to plantations like hers. Some found the echoes of her blood in their own bodies, a living proof of the horror long denied. A few even confronted local archives, demanding recognition, pushing back against the polite silence that had surrounded her name. Their efforts gave the story new life, not just as a haunting legend, but as a matter of living history. Writers and filmmakers followed. Novels hinted at her story, thinly veiled behind fictional names. Documentaries whispered of her estate, pairing the oral histories with the crumbling images of her house. In each retelling, she became less a forgotten widow and more a symbol, the embodiment of how power and obsession corrupt, how slavery poisoned even those who thought themselves untouchable. And yet, despite the growing attention, her name remained half hidden. Official histories of Georgia still brushed past her, preferring to speak of generals and battles, of cotton and commerce. But in the margins, in the stories of the descendants, in the soil itself, her shadow lingered. The land had memory, and it would not let her vanish. Today, those who visit the site of her plantation, marked now only by scattered stones and twisted trees, say the air is heavy, as if the earth itself still mourns. Some claim their cameras fail, that recordings capture faint cries they did not hear with their ears. Others stand in silence, feeling a weight on their chest, as though unseen eyes are watching. Whether ghost or guilt, no one can say. What is certain is that the story of the plantation mistress who bred slaves with her own sons has never truly died. It has shifted from memory to folklore, from folklore to history, and now from history into the living bloodlines of her victims' descendants. She wanted to build a dynasty of power and purity. Instead, she left behind a legacy of pain, a tangle of secrets that still unravel across centuries. Her name is less important than her shadow, because her shadow is what survives, woven into the haunted story of Georgia, into the American South, into the truth that cruelty, no matter how deeply buried, always rises again. In her last years, the mistress of the plantation was a woman out of time, living in the ruins of her own making. The war had ended. The fields no longer sang with labor. The cabins stood empty, and her empire had collapsed into silence. She still walked the halls of the great house, though it had grown cold and broken, her footsteps echoing where once there had been music and laughter. To her neighbors, she became a ghost even before she died, a relic of a past too ugly to acknowledge and too heavy to erase. Inside her mind, however, the past had not gone. Each night, when the lamps burned low and the wind rattled the shutters, she saw her sons, not as they were, but as she had bent them to be. She heard the cries from the cabins, the weeping of the women, the children born with eyes that mirrored her family's own. In her dreams, she was still in command, her voice carrying across the plantation like thunder, her orders obeyed without question. Today, the ruins of her plantation are nearly gone, swallowed by trees and earth, but the story remains. Guides on ghost tours whisper of her by lantern light, weaving her tale into the haunted fabric of the South. Descendants of the enslaved still carry fragments of her memory, their bloodlines proof of what she tried to bury. Writers and historians return again and again to her shadow, finding in her life the clearest example of how power, left unchecked, rots the soul. She wished to be remembered as a matriarch, the founder of a dynasty, a woman of status and control. Instead, history remembers her as something else entirely. Her empire lies in dust, her family name erased, but her story endures as a curse, a warning passed from generation to generation. The land where she lived still holds her memory, whether in ghosts or in guilt. When the wind moves through the trees, some say it carries voices, of sons broken by their mother's will, of women whose cries were never heard, of children who lived as living testaments to a crime unspoken, and above them all, the cold voice of the mistress herself, still commanding, still unrepentant, echoing through time. But history has its own judgment. Her cruelty did not save her. Her obsession did not protect her bloodline. In the end, all that remains is a ruined house, a cursed story, and the truth that no empire built on suffering can ever escape its ghosts. She thought she had built a legacy of power. Instead, she built a tomb, and in that tomb her name will remain, whispered forever as the story of the plantation lady who bred slaves with her own sons, Georgia's Secret, 1847.